For adding card items, we need to go to the card provider, because that's where we manage our card data in the end. And here we get this add item to cart handler. Now, whenever this function is called, we get the item that should be added to the cart. And then I basically want to check if that item is already part of the cart. So if we, for example, already have sushi in the cart. And if that's the case, I want to update the existing item. If it's not the case, I want to add a new item. And of course, we want to manage this as state in this component so that this component and therefore the context and therefore any components affected by that context are re-evaluated whenever the cart data changes. So here we want to import useState or useReducer. Both are React hooks which allow us to manage state. And I will go for useReducer here because this will be a bit of a more complex state which we're managing here. Because we'll have to check whether a meal is already part of the cart or not. And for removing, we'll also have more complex logic. Hence, I will use useReducer for managing the state here. And therefore, as a next step, outside of this component function, I'll add my cart reducer function. Outside of the component function, because this reducer function won't need anything from that component. It won't need any surrounding data defined in this component. And it shouldn't be recreated all the time when the component is re-evaluated. Now you learned that in the reducer functions, you receive a state object and an action automatically by React. The action is dispatched by you later in your code, and the state is simply the last state snapshot of the state managed by the reducer. And then, as part of the reducer function, you have to return a new state snapshot. Now for this, I'll define another constant outside of the component function and outside of the reducer function, and that's my default cart state. Now that's simply an object where I say that I have no items, so an empty array, and a total amount of 0, therefore. And then it's this default cart state which I return here in cart reducer. Now with that, in cart provider, at the very top of this component function, we can call useReducer, this React hook which we're importing. And now as a first argument, we point at our reducer function here. We don't execute it, we just point at it. It will be executed by React for us then. And we set an initial state, and that's the default cart state. So I'm reusing that constant here. Now you learned that useReducer returns an array with exactly 2 elements. Hence we can use array destructuring to pull these elements out of that array and store them in separate constants. The first array element is always your state snapshot. So I will name it cart state here. The second element is this function which allows you to dispatch an action to the reducer. So I will name it dispatch cart action. Both names are up to you because it's the position which matters here in array destructuring. Now the cart state is now needed to construct this cart context object. Instead of hard coding the empty array here, I will access cart state.items, because we're now managing the items with state, and the total amount with cart state.totalamount. Now we can start dispatching actions. And I want to start with adding items to the cart. Here we can then dispatch a cart action. And as I explained when I introduced the useReducer hook earlier in the course, it's totally up to you what an action is. It could just be a number or a text, but typically it's an object which has some property which allows you to identify that action inside of your reducer function. So that in that reducer function, you can run different pieces of code depending on which action type was dispatched. And I will use type as a property name for identifying the action, but it's totally up to you how you name this. You could also name it identifier or whatever you want. But I will go with type and then follow this convention of having a string all caps identifier. Again, it's also just a convention, but a very readable and common one, which is why I will stick to it. And then here we have, let's say, a type of add. It could also be add item or add card item or whatever you want, but I'll keep it simple and short and just use add. Now, to add the item in the reducer function, I also want to forward the item as part of the action. So I will add a second property to this action object and name it item. This name is also up to you, and point at my item argument here, so that I'm forwarding the item, which I expect to get here on this function, to my reducer. And now we can go to the card reducer and start adding logic for adding a card item here. For this, I first of all want to add a if check and check if the action type is equal to add, because I only want to run this adding logic for this kind of action. At the moment, it is the only action type we have, but later we'll also have a remove action. If we want to, we can already dispatch this here, by the way. We can already add type remove here and forward the ID, let's say, like this in the remove item from card handler. Now we would have, theoretically at least, two kinds of actions which trigger this reducer, and therefore we want to check for which type of action it was triggered. And now in here, I want to update my card items. We could simply add our item as a new item in that array, but as I mentioned, I want to group items for the same meal together and manage the amount on a per meal basis. I also want to update the total amount, the total price, for all aggregated card items. Now let's start simple and simply add an item as a, item to the array though. And for this, we can simply create an array, maybe name it updated items, and set this equal to state items, so the items in the current state snapshot, which we get as a first argument in the reducer by React, and call concat. Concat is a built-in method in JavaScript which adds a new item to an array, but unlike push, it doesn't edit the existing array, but return a new array. And that's kind of important. You want to update your state in an immutable way, which simply means you don't want to edit your old state snapshot because of the reference value thing in JavaScript. That would mean that existing data in memory gets edited without React knowing about it. But instead, you want to generate a brand new state object, which you return. And concat gives us a brand new array instead of editing the old array in memory, which is better. And we want to concat this item, this action item to be precise, which we're getting. And I simply expect to have all the data I need on that action item. So the name, the amounts of items that should be added, the price. I expect to have all of that on the item which reaches this add item to card handler. Currently, we're not taking care about this yet in the other parts of the application, but we will do so in the future. Now, with that, we got the updated items. I also want to get my new total amount, or my updated total amount. And that should simply be the old total amount on the old state snapshot, plus, action.item.price times action.item.amount. So I expect to have an amount field on that item which we're getting, and a price field. And of course, if we multiply these two, we know by how much our total amount needs to change. And with that, we can return our new state. At the moment, I'm not checking whether our item is already part of the array, by the way. That's something we'll add in the future. For the moment, I will simply return a new state snapshot where I set items equal to updated items and total amount equal to updated total amount. And now we got this basic cart reducer finished. Now we need to make sure as a next step that add item to cart handler is being called from some components in our application, like the meals component, where we have all these meal items and the meal item form, with the appropriate data. So with an amount field on every item, with a price field on every item, with a name field on every item, with an ID field on every item. That's what I want to work on next.